Set in historical Japan, you play as a young woman whose family is brutally murdered in front of her by a mysterious masked organization. You'll then embark on a journey of revenge to locate these masked figures and assassinate them all. Am I talking about Assassin's Creed Shadows or Ghosts of Yotei? Well, it's actually both. So today we're going to put these RPGs into the boxing ring to determine which game is better and just compare and discuss these incredible RPGs. Let's go! Let me know your winner in the comments down below. And as always, this is for entertainment value only. I do like both of these games, but I am interested to know who you think is better in the comments down below. World design is first, and we shall start with Assassin's Creed Shadows. Now, one of the things that I really like about Assassin's Creed Shadows, not only is the fact that the world is actually quite pretty to look at. Like, Assassin's Creed's always had really good vistas as you climb up to those sync points and you sync and you look around and you see the world, but there's a really good use of color throughout the world, plus the seasons just really exemplifies that fact. And it does keep the world feeling fresh across a playthrough and just continuing to play as each season changes that sort of saturation of the world as well as the color of the trees, plus those subtle gameplay changes as well, like in winter when it is frozen, like the lakes are frozen, you can't swim in them, but also you can make noise when climbing across rooftops as like the icicles might like drop off and alert some of the guards. I do think this is a really interesting conversation to compare an Ubisoft style open world directly to Ghosts of Yotei, which we will get to, but a couple of other things to think about for Assassin's Creed is firstly you have the guided versus exploration modes where you can change in the setting. Guided mode is your typical mode where you'll have objective markers and you just kind of follow them. Exploration gives you a rough idea of where you'll find these objectives, and then you'll need to use the scout mechanic, which is unique to Assassin's Creed Shadows, on the map to try and generally find where those objective markers are, or you can just wander around the areas and hope that you find them. Now, I do like the idea of having this guided versus exploration, and that system is, in a way, relevant to Ghosts of Yotei, how it is that kind of exploration mode where you have the wind and you're sort of subtly following the wind rather than being directly guided to various objectives. However, I do think that Assassin's Creed Shadows does struggle with this. I did discuss this in my review as well, that these objectives that say go to this area and it'll be south of whatever or north of X and then it might be down here. It's not always accurate. It does struggle to sometimes actually locate those locations with the scouts because it's never exactly where you think it is, which is kind of the point, but it is a little bit annoying when you're just trying to find the icons and where you're supposed to go, which is why for the most part I played Assassin's Creed Shadows on the guided mode. It is also a little bit difficult sometimes to just generally navigate the world in Assassin's Creed Shadows unless you are following the roads. Off-roading is quite cumbersome as trees are very dense, there's a lot of high ground and like cliff faces that you can't really climb up, and sometimes when there are objective markers or things you want to go to that are in the wilderness, getting there is really linear. You'll have to like follow the very specific path the game wants you to get there via following a road. You can't just like beeline it through the bush, which I don't appreciate. I'm personally just like to get to my objectives as fast as possible. Ghosts of Yotei, on the other hand, now we did just do the review, so I don't want to rehash too much about what I discussed there, but what I really love about Ghosts of Yotei's world is some of the same things that I like about Assassin's Creed Shadows, but it's very much exemplified or pushed that a little bit further, like the world, the use of color, and especially the way the particle effects like bounce off each other. Like Assassin's Creed Shadows does a little bit of this with the leaves and the wind rustling, but it's a core element to Ghosts of Yotei and that exploration experience. And that exploration loop is probably the best part of Ghosts of Yotei, to be honest, because each region is just so distinct in terms of its color palette, the way it's set up, and you've got the ridge at the very top with like the snow, and then you've got the just general grasslands where you start the game, and all the regions just look so vastly different and you really feel like you're going on that journey, whereas Assassin's Creed Shadows, some of those regions, especially a lot of them, kind of blend together because there is just so many towns and castles and villages and everything, and that's just generally how Ubisoft games are. There's a lot of icons and things to do on the map, and Ghosts of Yotei to some regard is very similar in that, even the fact that they both have like a sumi painting and a lot of these similar activities, like you've got the bamboo strikes in Yotei, or say the katas that you do for Yasuke in Assassin's Creed Shadows. Similar types of activities in the world that you'll do. It's just that the way that Ghosts of Yotei presents them is much more natural. In Ghosts of Yotei, you'll naturally find them based on your own inquisitive nature or seeing them on the horizon. Whereas in Assassin's Creed Shadows, you're either following your compass at the top and be like, oh, yep, there's an icon over here, we'll go over there, or you are simply marking them on your map and just like beelining it using the autofollow or something to actually get there. I really really like the way that it's handled in Yotei, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's bad in Shadows either. It's just that self-discovery and that vibe feeling you get from Yotei is just so much stronger than Assassin's Creed Shadows, in my opinion. And I think as well, like, there's just something to be said about the way Ghost of Yotei uses UI or doesn't use UI in some regards. Like when you're just out exploring and you simply just see Atsu and the horse and you're following the wind and you're just really taking in that world and that environment, and it pulls you into that experience of discovery and exploration into the world. Whereas Assassin's Creed Shadows uses the UI elements to kind of push you those directions. And I just think it's a different philosophy. And personally, I do think that Ghost of Yotei does this better, and that's why it wins our first category. Progression is our next category, and you know what? Let's start with Ghost of Yotei again. So where Ghost of Yotei's progression is mostly linked to combat, Yotei's is mostly tied to exploration, and it really feeds into that world design discussion, and that's why I wanted to continue it here. So ultimately, your progression in Ghost of Yotei is led by two things. It's by finding the locations just in the world, the hot springs, the bamboo strikes, the wolf dens, the fox dens, that give you the increase to your overall health, your spirit, or your technique points, and actually learning these skill points, which you'll need to find those altars of reflection. Now, sometimes those altars of reflection might be at campsites that are protected by enemies that you need to defeat, but ultimately progression in Ghost of Yotei is really handled as a reward for your exploration and seeking out these new things and new stuff to do. Like, you'll just see them on the map, or you'll see that red tree in the distance, and you'll know that if you go to that location, you get a HP upgrade. So you go over there and do it, because there's always that distinct identity about what you find in the world. Gear progression is like a lot simpler than in Assassin's Creed Shadows as well, being that you have the armor set specifically, and you just need to pick one piece of armor. You'll get the 3 passives, and then charms, which are found by the fox dens or just by other activities in the world as well. Now, this simplified nature of gear progression does work in Yotei's favor because of how almost minimalistic a lot of the game's elements are, and this is reflected in the gear progression as well, in that it's not overly done with levels and, you know, you're constantly finding gear and charms and whatever. You have to seek this stuff out and do it of your own accord if you really want to progress in that way. Alternatively, though, you can upgrade your weapons that you forge and your armor, etc., which absolutely is part of that core experience. But I do think Yotei handles this in a really intelligent way that really links that world design and exploration into its core gameplay loop and progression in a really smart way. Assassin's Creed Shadows, on the other hand, is a pretty standard progression system for RPGs and also the new Assassin's Creed games, except here you have both Naoe and Yasuke that you need to level up. Now, luckily, when you do level up one of them, you do level up the other, but you will do this by collecting knowledge points at various shrines, which will increase your knowledge rank, which will then, as you level up yourself and gain skill points, you'll then be able to gain skill points higher in the mastery trees for all of the different weapons, as well as their specific trees, like the assassination ones for Naoe, or the combat-focused samurai ones for Yasuke. There is a lot of tangible skills here that add new features to a lot of the weapons and the stealth, which we'll cover a little bit deeper in the combat section, as I think it's really relevant there, but which in some regards I do think is stronger than in Ghost of Yotei, as you have most of your overall kit pretty early in the game, and then the skill progression and like learning those techniques doesn't advance that much further. Whereas in Assassin's Creed Shadows, you're constantly getting those knowledge ranks, leveling that up, which in turn lets you get further in that skill tree and unlock like brand new skills, which are tangible skills that you're actually using, that you get to play around with and decide whether you like it or don't like it, as well as more passive or just like mechanical things like the stealth tools that Naoe has, like the kunai, etc., or even just generally being able to double assassination with the tanto, or the chain assassination that the bow staff has. So there's a bit more depth to that progression system because it is more level focused, and I do like that aspect of Assassin's Creed Shadows. What I don't like, and I think isn't as strong, is the gear progression. It's a bit of a mess because you'll be constantly getting gear, and there's just so much useless gear in this game. And I think it is really a criticism of the way that these newer Assassin's Creed games have been handling gear progression in terms of weapons and armor, in that for the most part, you're essentially just seeking legendary weapons and armor. Everything else that's below that tier is kind of irrelevant, and this is exemplified in Assassin's Creed Shadows because the best like passives that you can put on your weapons and armor come from those legendary gear, and then you can use that legendary passive and attach it to other legendary gear, right? So you're just beelining it for that specific type of gear and always focusing on it, and anytime you get anything that's below that tier, it's just kind of irrelevant. And there's so many loot crates and things that you can open in Assassin's Creed Shadows that it trivializes that process because you just see them and you know that there's not going to be a legendary in there. So you're only really opening it for the materials to use to upgrade your stuff. And I just think there's too much of that gear progression where everything is tied to levels and just like stat numbers that don't totally mean something, even though sometimes they do. It's better than some of these other Assassin's Creed games that have been coming out in the modern era. But just personally comparing it to Yotei, I do think that's why Ghost of Yotei wins this progression category as well, because of how clearly tied the exploration is to the progression loop and just the overall game experience. Whereas Assassin's Creed Shadows, the whole leveling system and gear progression is very separated from the journey you are on as Naoe and Yasuke. Story and questing, starting with Assassin's Creed Shadows again. So feudal Japan is the setting here in 1579. Yasuke, one of the main protagonists, is a foreigner to this land, just arriving, and is the first of the two protagonists that you will meet. Now, after an intro period with Yasuke, you will jump 6 months in time, and he is the head samurai of Oda. This is where you will meet Naoe. Naoe is an assassin in training by her father and some other mysterious figures. And on that day that you have jumped to, Yasuke and Oda are attacking Naoe's village. During these events, Naoe's father is killed by a mysterious organization, eventually known as the Shin Bakufu. And your job is to hunt down all the members of the Shin Bakufu and defeat them, whilst learning about Naoe and Yasuke's past, how these intertwine, and how their futures will connect them and bring them together. That is the initial story setup for Assassin's Creed Shadows. Now, when you take a step back, it's very similar to Ghost of Yotei's story premise, which we will touch on in a little bit. But how does it really work in Assassin's Creed Shadows? Well, it's really just all about assassinating targets. Almost every mission is simply to find a certain target and assassinate them. At a certain point, that does get a little bit frustrating. Like, there is some more depth to that, as there are some set pieces around how you find these targets and eventually how you interact with them. But ultimately, that's really what you see on that objective board. It's just a list of targets that you're essentially taking out, which does make sense for the type of game that Assassin's Creed is, but it does get a little bit muddy in the middle. Now, I'm just going to cover some light spoilers for the Assassin's Creed Shadows storyline, especially that second act. Now, if you haven't played it, I won't be spoiling anything too drastic. I'm not going to go through all of the beats, but I just want to cover a couple of things that I think really add to my enjoyment of the Assassin's Creed Shadows story, but do skip ahead to the timestamp on screen if you want to skip this section. But what that really is Naoe's connection with the Assassin's Creed, especially her mother, and the second or third act of the game as you learn about her connection to the Assassin's Creed. And Yasuke's connection to the Templars, I think, is really interesting content that it's a shame you have to play 60 hours of Assassin's Creed Shadows just to get to that point. Like, you have to deal with all of those assassination targets before the game really opens up. It becomes a sort of experience that I really enjoy. And then that's actually exemplified by the DLC that recently came out, which I think has an exceptionally strong story and I did quite enjoy as well, which I have made a video on separately. But I think with that aspect, Naoe and Yasuke work really well together. However, there's just a lot of weirdness in some of these cutscenes throughout the game where one of them just disappears after the cutscene ends because you just pick which one you're going to play as, and that is resolved in the recent DLC. However, that was a big criticism that I had throughout Assassin's Creed Shadows story, even if I really enjoyed the story, especially towards the end, and connected with Naoe's journey. I really liked Naoe, even if I wasn't a huge fan of Yasuke. Ghost of Yotei, on the other hand, is set in 1603 Ezo. Ghost of Yotei follows a new ghost, Atsu, a mercenary seeking revenge for the murder of her family by the Yotei Six. As Atsu embarks on her journey, she adopts the persona of the Onryo, a vengeful spirit from Japanese lore. It's really interesting how similar the story setups and the overall plot is for Assassin's Creed Shadows and Ghost of Yotei, both being set in Japan, playing a female protagonist and, having their family murdered in the intro by a strange organization.
Coincidence? I think not!
Now, if you did watch my review for Ghost of Yotei, you'll know that the story was one of the points that I wasn't really a huge fan of. And I think it's really because the main journey is about that Yotei 6 and dealing with them. And ultimately, across the story, there isn't a ton else that is going on. There is a couple of really interesting twists and turns, which I won't spoil because the game only did just come out, but there is a couple of really interesting characters that I personally connected with that really bring out Atsu's personality and really shape her journey. But ultimately I did feel like we're really just taking on these 6 bosses, and then after you've done that, the game is over. Whereas Assassin's Creed Shadows, you had that same concept with the Shin Bak-Fu. Once you defeated that organization, there was essentially a whole nother act that brought in the Assassin's Creed and Templars stuff to the game. Whereas Ghost of Yotei, it's just about that revenge plot. And that's also why I felt it was a little bit weaker, because I personally didn't connect with Atsu the same way that I did with Nawe. And that does actually reflect a little bit in the way the cutscenes are directed in Ghost of Yotei. There is a lot of standing around in the cutscenes where the characters are just simply standing or sitting around in a circle talking to each other. That was a little bit disappointing just from an engagement perspective. There are cutscenes that are different, they're not all like that. However, that was something that I did notice and struggle with across my journey, one of the key complaints that I had. So ultimately, I do think that story and questing is won by Assassin's Creed Shadows here, as I did enjoy the story and the questing specifically better in Assassin's Creed Shadows because of the end payoff that I actually connected with, whereas in Ghost of Yotei, I didn't feel that end payoff was as strong as it is in Assassin's Creed Shadows. Technical is our next category. This encompasses graphics, performance, bugs, and just generally anything that isn't covered in the other categories. Assassin's Creed Shadows is what we'll start with here again. Now, back at launch, I did play this on my PC and my 4090 with all the settings maxed out and didn't really have any major FPS drops or issues. I did have that weird texture streaming bug that I mentioned in the review build, but this is thankfully gone. I only had that back then when I don't know anyone else had experienced that. I think that was just a me thing, unfortunately. But recently I did return to Assassin's Creed Shadows for the Claws of Awaji expansion and didn't really have any major issues beyond a couple of crashes in the later missions, but that was in the review build and I haven't seen anyone have any problems with it since the game actually did come out. Do let me know if I am wrong in the comments down below. But ultimately, I think Assassin's Creed Shadows does perform extremely well in terms of the PC release, and there is also something like a credit, I suppose, to a game like that is releasing across multiple platforms, which is a little bit different to Yotei that is just on PlayStation, right? It's a lot easier to optimize a game for one specific console, even though there is a pro version, right? But simply for that, compared to Assassin's Creed Shadows that launched on Xbox, PlayStation, and on PC, along with having a PS5 Pro version as well, I believe, at launch. So it's definitely more challenging to optimize for 3 different platforms, especially PC being, the most complicated of those. And it's worth noting Assassin's Creed Shadows was the first of the modern Assassin's Creed games that didn't come to the old generation. It was just Xbox Series S and X and PS5, which you can for sure see that graphical leap in Assassin's Creed Shadows compared to those titles, especially exemplified by the seasons and how expansive the overall world is. And it is a bit of a testament, I suppose, to Ubisoft and being able to launch a game in such a quality state that is this large and had so much going on at launch and hasn't really had many problems with it since that point. Ghost of Yotei, on the other hand, I did only play this on my PS5 Pro, and I experienced a few bugs actually in the review period, which I did show off in the review. Plus, I did have 2 crashes in the late game sections and a couple of other hiccups here and there. But overall, it was extremely polished and sort of what you expect from a PlayStation exclusive with its multiple graphics modes and everything like that. I do, however, think that for this specific category in this specific video game versus, there isn't a ton to say for Assassin's Creed Shadows or Ghost of Yotei, as they both really don't have any major technical issues in my mind that I experienced while playing them for the review period for both of them, or even returning to them today. Even though Yotei hasn't been out as long, they both performed quite well with a couple of minor hiccups here and there. So there's not a lot of discussion really to be had about this aspect. However, I do tend to believe that I think just by the sheer difficulty of making a game for 3 different platforms, taking that leap to next gen only, and actually showcasing that leap specifically, where if you think about Ghost of Yotei and Ghost of Tsushima, when you look at those games being Ghost of Yotei as a PS5 exclusive compared to Ghost of Tsushima as a PS4 exclusive, is there drastically a major difference between the way those 2 games operate and play? Not really. Yes, they are absolutely exceptional in their own right in terms of the way that the game is technically a marvel to look at. However, the leap from Assassin's Creed Shadows compared to, say, Mirage, playing that on an old gen to a new gen, you can definitely see that a Shadows really uses that new gen tech, whereas I think Ghost of Yotei only really uses it for instant fast travel. Do you know what I mean? So I think that's why this category goes to Assassin's Creed Shadows. All right, quick pause here to recap. Assassin's Creed Shadows is on 2, Ghost of Yotei is on 2. Before we go into this last category, let me know who you think the winner is in the comments down below. And we'll start the combat section with Assassin's Creed Shadows. Now, I think if you really wanted to shorten my opinion of this down to like basically one sentence, I would say Nawe combat good, Yasuke combat bad. Like, I really was not a fan of Yasuke's combat and just generally playing him in Assassin's Creed Shadows. It's like the biggest complaint that I had with the overall game experience. So let's start with Nawe. Nawe is one of the best assassins I think they have ever handcrafted. She moves exceptionally quickly. Her parkour is so fun. Stealth has seen a significant overhaul here, being that you can prone, use that to stealth across buildings and like sort of hide against the lip of a building so people can't see you, or crawl under buildings, or even just go through like pools of water and everything. Really exceptional the way that the stealth mechanics have actually been elevated in Assassin's Creed Shadows, plus the use of shadows, being that if you're not in a light source, you will actually still be invisible even if you're not hiding in the bushes or something like that. And that is really great. I think that's some of the best stuff that's in Assassin's Creed Shadows. And then when you do get into the combat, Nawe's combat is quite fun. She uses a katana, a kusarigama, a tanto, and now a bow staff as well. So plenty of variation in her overall kit. And all these weapons feel quite unique and have a different feel to them because of the way you've got the skills, and you can use them in different ways, and the speed difference between using something like a tanto or using something like a katana. You really feel that in terms of the overall playstyle and identity of those weapons. Yasuke, on the other hand, yes, he has that same weapon identity, which feels really strong, with the long katana, the naginata, the kanobo, the yumi bow, and the teppo being the two ranged options. Now, this is something we'll get into more in the Ghost of Yotei section. However, a core part of my Yotei review was how the 5 weapons that you have access to in Yotei didn't work for me, as they all blend together and it's just simply a game of rock, paper, scissors with no real identity for each of these weapons. In Assassin's Creed Shadows, each of these 7 weapons and 2 ranged weapons all have a very deep skill tree with vastly different animations, attack speeds, often those passive effects being quite different as well, and the weapon skills are all unique to the various weapons. This means that you can really handcraft a build and use a weapon that you really enjoy using. You like those attack animations, you like those skills, or you might really like the passives, and you can really double down on that aspect of the overall kit. And I think that is something that is lacking in Yotei, which we'll cover shortly. But I do want to touch on Yasuke briefly. So the problems that I had with Yasuke is where Nawe handles like an F1 car, Yasuke handles like a monster truck missing its 3rd wheel. 4th wheel? How many wheels monster trucks have? They have 4. Anyway, you get the point, right? Like, he just handles very poorly. He doesn't feel like he fits in this game because there's so many things that he can't even access. Like, Nawe has the grappling hook, and there's a lot of these knowledge points and shrines that you need the grappling hook to be able to get to certain locations or climb certain buildings, and Yasuke simply just can't do those activities. And that's just really unfun to play him in the overall just like general exploration and play experience. And then in combat, I think he really trivializes the combat experience as well, because he is just so overpowered. Like, you're just kind of two-tapping every enemy, especially when you make a really solid build. And unless you're playing on the new Nightmare difficulty that recently came out, even on the hard difficulty at launch and even today, Yasuke just trivializes the combat system to the point where you're not engaging in its mechanics. Whereas Nawe, because she's a lot weaker, and you really need to use the mechanics of the game and the posture attacks and breaking their stagger bar and then following up with these critical hits and everything. And I just think that I just never had any fun with Yasuke's combat system. Even today, returning with the Claws of YG DLC and the new kit that it added for him, just wasn't for me, but Nawe is actually really, really fun. And all right, let's talk about Ghost of Yotei, and we'll start with that criticism about weapons. Now, my point here is ultimately that you aren't using these weapons for the enjoyment of using them. You're simply using them to trump the enemy's card, right? It's like playing Uno and dropping your draw 4, or, you know, activating a trap card, right? Enemy has a shield, well, I got to pull out the kusarigama. Enemy's using a spear, I've got to use the dual katanas. And ultimately, it's just that aspect of the game's combat system that I wasn't a fan of, because in Ghost of Tsushima, the stances really felt unique, and because they're all linked to that one weapon being the katana, and the way that animations are different with each weapon, you can feel that impact of, you know, when you switch to the water stance and you know what those animations are going to be, and that impact against the weapons that the enemy is using, I felt was really strong here. And then in Ghost of Yotei, they just pushed it that little bit further by, for some reason, making Atsu carry like an entire arsenal of weapons that, you know, you basically need a cart to carry if you want to bring them all with you, but they just don't feel different or unique enough. They all have the same relative attack speed. It's just that the animations are slightly different, but you're essentially just hot swapping between them in every combat encounter without really learning each one or understanding the intricacies and complexity of each one and finding one that you really like. And that was the downside for me in the combat system. However, ultimately, the combat system in Yotei is still really strong. I really love the way that that you have to dance with the enemies around you, and it doesn't rely on like a lock-on system where you're like one focusing the enemy in front and the enemies on the sides, just wait for you to finish that one. I love that aspect of Tsushima and in Yotei that you need to attack in multiple directions and focus on the flow of combat rather than tunnel visioning on the specific enemy that you are actually attacking. The stealth in Ghost of Yotei is the really standard affair and doesn't contain any of those additional aspects that Assassin's Creed Shadows has, like the manipulation of the shadows or the prone mechanics that you will find in there. This is a really hard category to pick a winner for because I fundamentally have issues with both of these combat systems on a personal level. I didn't vibe with Yasuke's combat system, even though I really enjoy playing as Nawe, and the weapon hot swapping in Ghost of Yotei really wasn't for me. However, I do think that Ghost of Yotei wins this category. Despite the issues that I have with that system, I think fundamentally Assassin's Creed Shadows has more of a design issue with the combat system through Yasuke and forcing you into that dual protagonist system compared to Yotei's system with the weapons, which I do think is actually more of a personal issue. Like looking around other reviews and seeing people talk about it, most people are pretty okay with the weapon hot swapping. Apparently it's a get good or skill issue that I apparently have, despite the fact that I finished the game on hard before the game was even out. I kid anyway, but thank you guys for watching this video till the end. Let me know your winner in the comments down below and what you think of both of these games. Keep it civil, right? Like, we're all just here to have fun. I do like both of these games. I did enjoy my playthrough of both of them. We're here just to discuss great video games because that is really what the point of all of this media is. Thank you guys for watching this video till the end. Thank you to our members for supporting the channel. My name is Norza and I hope you have a great day.